All right, we will start. We will continue with our discussion on research methodology. In my last week discussion, I discussed with you comparative studies, particularly how to engage in comparative Buddhist comparative studies. In fact, today basically I will be talking about historical, social and anthropological, basically these three areas. They are kind of connected together. But we will briefly look at historical and anthropological, but we will be looking at a little bit in detail sociological studies. But basically, when we do Buddhist studies, Buddhist research, one area where there is a lot of room for research is historical studies of Buddhism. Now, when we say historical studies of Buddhism, it could be about the history of the doctrines, history of the Buddhist schools, or history of text, history of people, or history of institutions such as the Sangha, kinship, sasana, nikaya, and so on. All these things may be studied from a historical point of view. So there are so many things if you want to do research, if you prefer to follow this stream of historical studies, you can do history of many things. Basically, you know that in the Buddhist tradition, we have long historical tradition about the sasana. Sasana Vansa, which was written in this country. And it is very well known for the history of sasana. Now, if you go to Sri Lanka, we have very well-known Mahavansa, and then the subsequent parts of Mahavansa are described as Chulavansa, but basically everything goes as Mahavansa. Now, Mahavansa start from the very beginning of the Buddhas and then finally goes into the history of Sri Lanka. And in fact, that Mahavansa writing still continues from time to time. Mahavansa is being written both in Pali and also in Sinhala. So the historical studies are not unknown or anything new for the Buddhist tradition, Buddhist studies. Now, important thing is, when we talk about the academic study of history, academic study of history has its own peculiar issues to be dealt with. Because usually, traditionally we think, okay, history is, the record of something that happened. So basically we think that history is the record of things that happened. And also we believe that when we say history, that there is, true happenings and incidents are there. We know about these things and then we record these things. However, this understanding seems to be pretty simplistic, because history is very much subjective perspective. What happened in the history depends on many different things. Now, if you are a Buddhist monk, history from the perspective of a Buddhist monk can be one thing. If you are a woman, history from a woman's perspective can be something a little bit different. So depending on who you are, what is your educational background, what is your social background, what is your preferences, these many things can color what you think to be the history. So, in fact, for example, some time ago we could write, we can say something like the history of Burma. Okay, we could write the history of Burma. But today, hardly anybody will accept the history of Burma as a proper theme. Rather, they would say a history of Burma. Now, when you say what is the difference between this the and a, now, idea is that when we say the history of Burma, we are saying that there is one particular history, one particular way of looking at that, one particular the set of events to be taken as history. But as I said earlier, we can ask, are there historical facts, historical data? What becomes history? What becomes important for a historian? You know, it depends on many factors. For example, when we write the, suppose, ancient history of Myanmar, some people may be writing only about the economic history of the country. Nothing else. Economic history. What happened in the field of economy for during a certain period or during certain time period of the history. So you are only talking about the economics. So as history, what you take is, if the perspective is economics, then you are taking economics history. Or someone else can be writing on the religious history. When you are writing on religious history, you are not writing political history. Now, if you are writing on the political history, then you will not be writing too much about the religious history. When you write on political history, you may be writing on, different connections. The country had relationships with other countries. Country had wars and battles with other countries. All sorts of things you will be writing when you write political history. So and at the same time, you can write a general history. If you write general history, then of course you will be writing economics, cultural, politics, religious, and everything. I know that in Sri Lanka we have what is called university, history of Peradeniya University. They compile several huge volumes. Now that history covers all aspects, religion, literature, economy, and all these things. But that's a general history. But the issue with general history is, can one person write something like that general history? It will be enormously difficult for one person to write. So this, the history of Sri Lanka that I am referring to was written by so many people together. Economic aspect is written by one person, religious aspect is written by another person. So a group of people getting together and then writing general history of the country. But then on the other hand, each person will be writing history in one particular aspect. For example, again, because I don't know much about the Burmese history, in Sri Lankan Buddhist history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, I know that scholars have done research for their PhD degrees from the very beginning up to present time. So there are several, for example, early Anuradhapura period, then entire Anuradhapura period, then shift from Anuradhapura to Polonnaruwa, then Dabadeniya period, and then subsequent period. At least I know about 6 major works on history of Sri Lanka up to colonial period, 1815, researched by various scholars as part of their PhD research. Continuing story from very early beginning, so thorough study, different periods. Now different scholars. In fact, the scholars can do the same thing for the history of any country. Say, for example, Burma. If you look at, like from the very early period, recorded period, somebody can write, one particular period, and then another person can write the next period, and, doing research. So you can see that historical studies can be very widespread, and also depends on what type of perspective you are looking at history, whether it is religious, economics, political, cultural, all these things can be history. So history is not one particular thing, okay? And then we can write the history of Buddha Sasana as organization. But at the same time, somebody can write the history of particular chapter, particular Nikaya, particular group of Sangha, okay? And, things like that. Also can write on particular relationship, Myanmar-Sri Lanka relationship in Buddhism, Myanmar-Cambodia relationships, Myanmar-Thailand relationships in Buddhism, Myanmar-China relationships in Buddhism. So like that. Actually, history can be a very, very wide and vast area where when you look from Buddhist perspective. So history can be looked from many different perspectives. One particular perspective will be the Buddhist perspective. And also, you can write the history of Buddhism in Myanmar. Also, you can write the history of Sangha in Myanmar. Then, of course, you are talking about Buddhism, but particularly you are focusing on the institution of the Sangha, not any other thing. But when you say Sangha, we are talking about the Bhikkhu Sangha. What about the Tilashin, the female nuns? I mean, what is their history? You can also do research on that. So, like that. Within Buddhism, there are so many areas you can be writing. So history is a very vast field in that sense. Okay. Whatever the history you write, as I said earlier, at some point we believe that, okay, you write history, there is always one history. You can write about history and then that is it. But today that idea is rejected. If you write the history of Burmese nuns, that doesn't mean that somebody else cannot write history of Burmese nun differently. That's why I said you can't say the history of Buddhism. You have to say, in a way, a history of Buddhism. So in historical studies, not only historical studies, particularly today, in many studies, people don't want to give the impression that they are giving the final answer to the problems. I remember that several years ago when this Sri Lankan scholar, Ananda W.P. Guruge, he wrote a huge volume on Emperor Ashoka, very big volume, containing all the inscriptions. And the title of his book was A Definitive History of Ashoka. I remember there were many people criticized that title because they asked, how can you write a definitive history? I mean, the whole idea is that when you call something to be a definitive history, you are saying that so nobody else has to write about it now. Because you have written a definitive history. But the idea is that although you can write almost a definitive thing, but the people don't like to call it a definitive history or the history. I mean, we have to understand this the way the modern scholarships looks at. Sometimes, they go to an extreme, which is not very good. But on the other hand, many scholars tend to think today, particularly about history, you can't be writing a definitive history. History is not only one particular thing. Even about the same phenomenon, you can write history from different point of view. So depending on the point of view, what you consider to be more important and less important can be different. So reader has to be very careful in reading, but the writer can, present what he or she considers to be history from his or her point of view. So long as, this point of view is made clear, we have to be careful about when we read it. So we have to keep in mind that this book has been written from this particular point of view. Now, particularly today, in the entire world, particularly in the Western world, there's a whole new group of studies area of study called feminist studies. Feminist studies means you look from the point of view of woman, feminism. So the feminist, the viewpoint. Now, they say that up to this point, everything has been written on the man's point of view. What about the woman's point of view? How would it be like if a woman looks at these things? Now, accordingly, there are lots of studies, particularly if you take religion, about Christianity, so many studies. Now, if you take Buddhism also, actually, I should talk about it separately, but I just give you as an example. So the feminist point of view, woman's point of view. Now, if you look at the history from a woman's point of view, what will be the most important things? Now, the point of view so far we have been using is man's point of view. In a man's point of view, for example, a war between two countries will be very important. But what about the women? Would they consider the same thing to be very important or not? Now, if you look at the history of women in a particular country, how they would perceive the history, and their role, will be very differently viewed. So you can see that perspective is very important. So woman's perspective, economic perspective, historical perspective, so on. Now, up to today, we don't talk about man's perspective because everything is done from man's perspective. But, on the other hand, it is man's perspective sometimes. What a man would consider to be important will be different. So, like that. So, the perspective, viewpoint is something very important. Whether historical data are there, how would you understand it? Now, for example, when we talk about the Sri Lankan history, Mahavansha up to the modern period was written by the Buddhist monks. So usually when you read the Mahavansha, what you get is about each king and then what the king did and what the king did not do, basically to the Sasana. And also there are few other sort of pieces of information also. What the king did to the economy, whether the king built reservoirs, things like that. But basically the book reports, Mahavansha reports, what the kings did to the Sasana. But then, during that ancient period, why do we have to talk about only the king? Does that mean that only the king lived in the country? What about the ordinary people? What about the men and women? What did they do? So, but we are talking only about the king and what he did. I mean, in a way, you can say that not everybody is very important. King is an important person. What he does and what he does not do is very important for a country. So there are some reasons, why you are talking about the kings. But on the other hand, today we cannot criticize the ancient historians for not doing what we are thinking today. But on the other hand, we can try to do a historical study on those periods, not only about king, other people also. Usually in the ancient history, if you take Mahavansha in Sri Lanka, history talks about the Sangha and the kings. But then there were some kings who did not like the Mahavihara, who wrote the history. Then what? Naturally, that king is not a good king. he is bad. But was he really bad? I mean, he is called bad because, he did some bad things to the Mahavihara. But they did good things to the Abhayagiriya. Then what? Do we have the history from Abhayagiriya perspective? It will be different. Now, which one is the history now? In the same country, about the same son, same king, you can have different perspectives. You take a king like Mindong in this country, there are so many perspectives you can look at. So from the Buddhism perspective, you can look at him, what he did to the Buddhism. But what about the foreign policy? What about the other things? What about the economy? And all these things. What happened during that period? No, these are different. So if Buddhist monks will be writing history of Mindong, he will give a lot of emphasis for writing the Tripitaka and the Sanghayana and, things like that. But what about his failures as a politician? Of course, he could not, British came and undertook the country during that period. So, things like that. So, you see, history doesn't have one perspective. And also, you cannot say, this is the correct perspective. You can't say that. It depends on, how you. But then, of course, as scholars, we can try to be as impartial as possible, as objective as possible. But still, your perspective will change. Sometimes you can say, write the history. Okay, I'm going to write the history on King Mindong from religious point of view. Then, of course, you are only talking about religion. So from the very beginning, you say my perspective is the religious perspective. I'm writing only on the perspective of religion. Then, of course, you have a reason to talk only that. But if you write the history, but then only you deal only with the religion, that's, of course, being very narrow. You see? So, the question is whether there is one correct history, whether there is one correct perspective, or are there many perspectives. So you see, history is not something that you can really write from, say, one point of view. Now, again, if I go back to the Mahavansha in Sri Lanka, now that is basically considered to be the history written by the Sangha, basically of the history of Buddhism. But of course it talks about the wars and the kings, what they did, and things like that also. But then modern historians would not accept everything in the Mahavansha. But if what Mahavansha says is corroborated by something else, for example, particularly, there is a tendency among the modern scholars to go, when we talk about the history, to go to the inscriptions. You know what the inscriptions, like Asoka inscriptions, the documents written on the stone. So we know that now Ashoka's inscriptions, we can think that they were written by Ashoka during Ashoka's period. So therefore many people think that the written material is okay, but inscriptions provide better, more reliable information. But it could be yes or it could be no. Simply because it is an inscription, we can't say that it provides better information or more reliable information. Because even a ruler, king, can write some inscriptions glorifying himself. So nobody can prevent it. So on the one hand, scholars argue that inscriptions are more important than the literature. But it depends. More recently, if you like to read, there is one, the scholar, of course, now it is some time, maybe about 20 years back, his name is Gregory Chopin. He is an Australian scholar, Buddhist scholar, Australian Buddhist scholar, who has used inscriptional evidence much more than written literary material. His papers, I mean, published in many places, but there are a couple of collections. There is one collection called Monks, Bones, and something like that. Monks, Bones, and anyway, I don't remember the exact title. Okay, I think something like this. Monks, Stones, and Bones. If you just Google it, you can find it. Monks, Stones, and Monks, Bones, and Stone, or Monks, Stones, and Bones. But anyhow, stones means basically inscriptions. What are the bones? Bones means, maybe the relics of the Buddha, or, whatever the things. But he thinks that, the evidence provided by these objects is more reliable. I remember one example. Like usually when we talk about religious activities, we think that the vandana, puja, and donations were made usually by the lay people, ordinary men and women. But there's something very interesting. There are lots of inscriptional evidence that such donations have been made by monks and nuns, particularly monks. Lot of donations. Now, that's a very interesting thing, because you don't find, in the literature, you don't find monks and nuns as donors, right? Usually monks and nuns, people who accept the donations, but not they themselves donating things. But in the history, bones, stones, and Buddhist monks. Okay, bones, sorry for this. Bones, stones, and Buddhist monks. So thank you very much for that help. So I'm sorry to mislead you folks. Okay, bones, stones, and Buddhist monks. So he showed that there is quite a lot of evidence in the literature that monks are becoming donors. Now, in the ancient religious history, Buddhist history, there's something very interesting, and we don't find it in the literature very much. So you see, the bones can be evidence. Stones means inscriptions can be evidence. Another very interesting thing that came out from this kind of studies was, like we talk about the Mahayana in India. Mahayana has a very great movement. But something very interesting, almost no evidence about Mahayana in the inscriptions. So finally, a lot of scholars today believe that Mahayana is not a separate sect in India. Mahayana monks existed among other monks. Okay? Because although we think that, okay, Mahayana started in India and, it spread into the other countries, actually Mahayana became more mainstream traditions outside India. In India, it looks like Mahayana existed within the same monastery. Right, like even among yourself, there can be different monks holding different views. So like that, different trends. And also, according to these scriptures, there is quite a lot of evidence about Sarvastivada monks. So Sarvastivada school has a very, very strong school in India. Now, this kind of information comes from inscriptions and other evidence. So for a historian, what you take to be the evidence, what you take to be the sources, is something very interesting. You go to those sources, and then you look at how to study. So I just gave you one example of and then also we can talk about initially I explained to you how to do a textual research, but at the same time we can also do textual research on the text. Historical research on the text. How can you recognize which text is older and which text is new, more recent? Now, that can be a very, very interesting example. How to understand the teaching and the doctrine from a historical method. So the historical perspective, historical method is something very, very interesting. You study different histories. Let me talk a little bit about what is considered to be the historical method. Now, when we say historical method, actually one of the main people who has adopted this method and studied Buddhist doctrine is Professor Richard Gombrich. Richard Gombrich, he was in Oxford University. Now he is retired, but still he is doing academic activities, Richard Gombrich. So the historical method, what he does is using historical method in order to understand the teaching of the Buddha, how the Buddhist teachings came about. Now he has a very interesting book. Actually, some time ago, he wrote this book, How Buddhism Began. Subtitle is something like Conditioned Genesis of Actually, follow-up of the series is What the Buddha Thought. It is a more recent one. But this is a little bit older. And then he also wrote What the Buddha, T-H-O-U-G-H-T, What the Buddha Thought. So, these are two very important examples of, historical method in order to understand the teaching of the Buddha. Now, what this historical method says is this. Historical method says that if you want to understand what the Buddha taught, you really have to know the society and the philosophy and the religion during the Buddha's time. So in order to understand properly the teaching of the Buddha, you have to look at the Brahmana religion, Upanishads, and the Vedas, and the Jainism, and particularly the Upanishadic philosophy, because Buddha belongs to the middle, not early Upanishad, but the middle Upanishad period. So Upanishads, and then Buddha's contemporary is the Jaina religion, and also many other religions like Ajivaka, Paribrajaka, and then we have 6 religious teachers mentioned in the Samanyapala Sutta. So Richard Gombrich says that in order to understand what the Buddha said, we have to know what was the philosophy during that time. Interestingly, when you read these books, very interesting, he shows several instances where Buddha was teaching his doctrine in response to Upanishadic teachings. In response to Upanishadic teachings. To understand why Buddha is, say for example, why Buddha formulated avidya paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijnanam, dwelling patissamuppada, he says that in order to understand why Buddha formulated it, you have to go to the Upanishadic text. In the Upanishads, there are certain teachings Buddha was really responding in the sense, Buddha was aware of those things, and Buddha gave a different formulation, different interpretation. So the different interpretation, to know the different interpretation of the Buddha, we have to know the interpretation of the Brahmanic religious tradition. Okay. Now, for example, how can you know what Buddhist Anattavada means, Buddhist Anatma means, Buddhist no soul means? Now, we ourselves, this group is confronted with this problem when we try to understand Nagarjuna's Swabhava. We are talking quite a lot. But it's very interesting, if you read Richard Gombrich, he shows that Buddha's idea of Atma is Upanishadic idea of Atma. So that is what the Buddha says that doesn't exist. So Upanishadic sense of Atma has been defined in a manner. So Buddha takes that definition and that concept, and Buddha shows that there is nothing like that in the human beings. So in other words, to understand Buddhist Anatmavada, Richard Gombrich says that we have to know what the Buddha was responding to. Now basically the idea is this, general idea would be to say no philosophy, no religion arises out of nowhere. It always has a context. It always has a context. Context means if you want to understand what the Buddha did, we have to know the context. Now for simple example, Siddhartha, when he got fed up with household life, what did he do? He went and joined the Sramanas. Why he joined the Sramanas? Because Sramanas were there already, isn't it? Because during the Buddha's time, there were Brahmins and Sramanas, Samana Brahmana, always Samana and Brahmana. Now you can't just be a Brahmana because you have to be a born Brahmana, right? So you can't join the Brahmanas, okay? Because you have to be born Brahmana. But if you are non-Brahmana, then you can join the Sramana. Sramanas had all types of people, including some Brahmins were among the Sramanas, we can imagine, and the Shastriyas, Shudras, Vaishyas, and whoever that did not like the Brahminic tradition, they became Sramanas. Now Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha, becomes a Sramana. So Sramana tradition was there. And Buddha we call Samano Gotamo, not we. During the time of the Buddha, people called him Samano Gotamo. But Samano Gotamo was not used by the Buddhist. It was used by other people to describe Buddha. Every time they called Samano Gotamo. So Buddha was identified as a Samana. So if you don't know about Samana, how can you understand what the Buddha did? And same thing Muni. Buddha is called Sakya Muni. But Muni is not a Buddhist term. Muni was already there. Buddha was identified to be the Sakya Muni, Muni of the Shakyas. So you see, this historical method is something very, very important. I'm not saying that everything what the Buddha said and did this, responding to history. But if you don't know the contemporary history of the Buddha, very difficult to understand certain things. So this historical method means you locate a particular movement or particular tradition within the context of history. Now, within the context of history means you are looking at the philosophy, history of religion, and history of religious organization, and you locate Buddhism within that, and then you take it from there. Now, something we Buddhist studies people don't do is we don't study Jainism. But actually, if you study Jainism, both Jaina doctrine and Jaina monastic Vinaya, you will see there are lots of similarities between Jaina Vinaya and Buddhist Vinaya. Lot of similarities are there. How come? But we don't know even. So then who borrowed from whom? We know that Jainas were there when the Buddha was born really. So Jaina is older. Not Jaina Mahavira necessarily, but Jainism was there. So there's a lot of similarities between Jainism and Dhamma also. There are a lot of concepts. But hardly Buddhist scholars do any Jaina studies. To do Jaina studies, you have to know the Jaina Ardha Magadhi, and then one of the very well-known Jaina scholars today is now very old, Padmanabh S. Jaini. Padmanabh S. Jaini, is very interesting. When he was a young guy, he studied in Sri Lanka, Vidyodaya Pirivena. And then from there he went back to India, and then finally ended up in University of California, Berkeley. So he retired as a professor of South Asian studies, and he has written a lot. Padmanabh S. Jaini. So actually he started from Sri Lanka, Padma, but he is not a Sri Lankan, he is Padmanabh S. Jaini. So he has written a lot on Jainism and Buddhism, comparative things, and quite a knowledgeable scholar. So if you look at writings of Padmanabh S. Jaini, you can know quite a lot of things about Jainism and also Buddhism. And then most of the Buddhist scholars we don't know anything about. But when we see those things, similarities in the Vinaya, it's very interesting. Sometimes I know Sri Lankan monks, at least I know one monk who went to do his PhD in Delhi University. He stayed in a Jain temple. Yes. But they were not Digambaras, they were Shvetambaras, I think so. And he stayed. And then he said life is not very different, Life is not very different. So the monastic life with Jainis and Buddhists were not very different according to him. So, pardon me for digressing, but what I trying to talk to you is this historical method. Don't misunderstand, I'm not saying that historical method is the method, but what I'm saying is when we do a historical study, actually not only the history of institutes or anything like that, we can even talk about the history of the teaching of the Buddha, or understand the teaching of the Buddha from historical point of view. So there are very interesting ideas when you look at from the historical point of view. Actually, there is quite a lot of historical research on history of Pali language, history of the Tripitaka, what are the older texts, what are the new texts, how can you decide, and quite a lot of scholarship in these areas. So the historical method is to take approach from taking history into consideration. Otherwise, if you just forget about the history, you can just read the text and try to understand it. But when Buddha talks about 62 views in Brahmajala Sutra, or when the Buddha talks about Ambatta Sutta, about caste system and all that, you can see that Buddha knew quite a lot about these things, right? So understanding the Dhamma from the historical perspective. And again, I am not saying that you have to agree with everything. You don't have to agree with everything that Professor Gombrich says. But for the sake of historical method, I think you need to read these books like How Buddhism Began, Conditional Genesis of Buddhism. Now, interestingly, Conditional Genesis of Buddhism, Buddhism tries to explain everything, origin of everything according to Paticamuppada. Richard Gombrich is applying the same principle to the Buddhism. Okay? If everything originates according to Paticamuppada, what about Buddhism itself? So what is the Paticamuppada origination? No? Conditioned genesis of Buddhism. So, he is using. So, the historical method, because I'm sure some of you will be liking to do historical research. Historical research about your own country and the Sasana, some aspects of the Sasana, and so on. History of Buddhist literature, history of the Sangha, and so on. But then, don't think that, simply because you are Burmese, you can write something on Burma. No. You really have to do it in a very methodical manner. How you, what do you take as the evidence? What do you take as the, the facts to develop something? So what are the material? How do you derive them? So, all these things are very important when you look at from historical perspective. So the historical studies of Buddhism, if I may summarize, I said two things. One thing is you can really study the history of institutes, say Nikayas, text, Sangha, organizations, and in all these things. Text and everything. The other thing, what I said is historical method. Now that is the research method. In that research method, you are just trying to understand something from historical point of view. So you try to see the society and the conditions during that time and then try to understand it. I don't know whether you have heard, when we were very small children and going to Dhamma school, and when we were learning the life of the Buddha, we were told that Buddha from the Tautisa Divyaloka, before coming to this world as Siddhartha, he looked for 5 things: Kala, Deepa, Desa, Kula, Mata. Now what is the meaning of this? Why Siddhartha wanted to, from the heaven, if he wanted to see Kala, time, Deepa, country, Desa, area, Kula, what is the family? And then Mata, mother. Now you know why Siddhartha wanted to see these things. I mean, he could have just come and because he has fulfilled all the paramitas, you just become the Buddha. No. This story is very important. Although, you know, it is just a story, but the story has some very important truth. That truth is, Buddhas have to be born in a particular period. I mean, there's quite a lot of indications in the Buddhist literature. And then what about this Mangala Kolahala? You have heard about Mangala Kolahala. Again, you know, we take these things very simply. Okay, I mean, like, nobody can believe that, you know, people were, clamoring about Mangala. But what it's tried to say is, you know, there were certain historical situations that coming up to make Buddha's arrival possible. Now suppose Buddha come and teach something, nobody understand. Then what? What can the Buddha do? But the time Buddha came to this world, it was a very mature period, because Upanishad philosophy was already there. And there were many other Shramana philosophers. You remember in my research, earlier discussions, I said that Buddha identified himself with Shramana groups, Sayang, Abhinya, Sachikatva. I mean, those Shramana groups are already there. Buddha identified himself with those people. Now, if Buddha was the only person, nobody will understand what the Buddha says. It will be very difficult. But the time of the Buddha was very mature period in the human history. Not only in the Indian history, in the entire human history, you can see that it's a philosophically very mature period. And people could understand what the Buddha and what the Upanishadic seers and the various Shramanas. I mean, look at the Sutta Nipata and all that. So many Shramanas are debating with each other, fighting with each other on philosophical matters. Now, where do they fight? Just on the street, you know, here and there under trees, so people can see them fighting. People can see them debating. People listen to them. They can hear. So, you know, there was a atmosphere, context, where, you know, people were philosophically mature. So when the Buddha said something, people could understand, because there were, that type of situation. I will stop for discussion, just narrating you one more incident. There is a story about when the Buddha was meditating under a tree in a little forest. There were young guys, group of people, 30 young guys with their partners. They went into this park. And then one of those people didn't have a partner, so he hired the woman to take. But the woman who was hired took away the things and she ran away. And then these young people were looking for this woman. And then they saw Buddha was seated. And then they asked from the Buddha about the woman. What the Buddha said? Buddha said, Attanang Gavesayatha. Now that can be a problem, if people did not know what it means. But when Buddha said, Attanang Gaveseyata, you look for yourself. Now that is very similar to certain Upanishadic expression. Upanishad already talking Adhyatma Vidya, Adhyatma, knowing about your Adhyatma, knowing about yourself. So the concept is familiar. When the Buddha said Attanang Gaveseyata, of course maybe Buddha said more than that. I think that is only the summary. But the concept Attanang Gaveseyata, you look for yourself. You try to discover yourself. Don't look for lost women, but look for yourself or something like that. So you can see that society was philosophically mature. So in order to understand from that perspective is what is called historical perspective. Okay. Maybe we'll have a short discussion and then we will move to the next subject. Do you have any questions or comments or anything? Yes, sir. We will continue. Historical studies is an important area. If you are going to study, going to choose that area, that's the interesting thing. Next, I will be discussing sociological studies of Buddhism. Now, sociological studies, anthropological and historical studies have certain similarities. But sociological studies is kind of central and among these studies, and also particularly among the modern scholars of Buddhism, particularly coming from United States, sociological studies are very popular. Now, textual studies and conceptual studies are more popular among the Buddhist scholars like England, Europe, and those countries. But then sociological studies, anthropological studies are popular among American, say other, the scholars. But that doesn't mean that exclusively, they do that study, but they are more popular. Now, one thing very interesting is basically sociology studies societies or social behavior of people. It focuses on how people as social groups behave and make decisions. An essential aspect of this mode of study is to have findings from field research to support one's conclusion. Now, when we are talking about sociological studies, actually we are not looking at what is in the books. We are looking at what is in the society, what is among the people. Now, that distinction you have to understand first very clearly. Say, for example, now any kind of Buddhist topic we can do textually, philosophically, and socially. For example, suppose you take the concept of dana. Dana means donation, giving. Now you can have textual study and conceptual study of dana. What is dana? What are the different kinds of dana? What are the discourses that discuss dana? All these things are conceptual. And also you can ask some philosophical questions. Okay? So the conceptual, and also you can talk about the historical concept. How dana gradually evolved, what are the things people gave to the Sangha first, and then subsequently, how these things evolved. And so, you can talk about dana in many different manners. How dana is practiced in many different countries. You can look at Sri Lanka, how people give dana, and Myanmar, how people give dana. So, what are the similarities and differences, all these things. Now, these are particular types of studies, we can say textual, comparative, and all that. However, if you are studying dana socially, means something different. When you study dana socially, actually what you are studying is how people practice dana in society. How people practice dana in society. Now, it is a good possibility that sometime you have certain things in the book, in the discourses. Okay, this is what dana and this is how dana should be practiced. Okay, but by looking at the book, you can't say that dana is practiced in Myanmar like this or Sri Lanka like this. For that, you have to really go to society, go to people, witness, observe how people give dana, talk to the people who give dana. Maybe you prepare a questionnaire and distribute that questionnaire and get the answers. So actually, sociologically, you are studying dana means how dana is being practiced in a society. Now you can talk about dana in Myanmar society. You can talk about dana in Sri Lanka society. Now what you do is not you are looking at the book, but you are looking at the practice. You are going to the field. Okay? Now, if you don't go to the field, then what happens is sometimes, we make very idealistic conclusions. For example, we say, okay, Burma is a Buddhist society. 94% people are Buddhist. So, all Buddhists by definition observe 5 precepts. Right? According to the book. Right? If you are a Buddhist, you observe 5 precepts, right? Then, can we conclude that 94% of people in Myanmar observe 5 precepts? Cannot. By definition, if they are Buddhist, they have to observe 5 precepts. But can we say that 94% people observe 5 precepts? How do we know that? If we want to know it. For example, you look at, say, whether people are observing the 5th precept, not taking liquor. You can look at the sale of liquor in Burma. And non-Buddhist are only 6%, right? So entire liquor sale is responsible for the non-Buddhist 6% or what? Stealing or other thing. Now, it's interesting. If you go by the book definition, it is one thing. But if you go to the society, it is a different thing. So you see the difference. One thing is, according to the book, we can give a definition. But if you really want to see what is happening, you have to go to the society and see. Now, sometime in Sri Lanka, we say jokingly, Sri Lanka is a Buddhist country, about 69% people are Buddhist. And Sri Lanka is one of the countries where drinking alcohol is very high. Okay? But if you go by the definition, 69% of people are not drinking, right? Because they are Buddhist. But then, who are these people drinking? If you want to find out, maybe you go to a wine store. We have in Colombo wine stores. And then, you go to a wine store and you observe one day who are the people coming to buy wine there. Or this thing. You can ask them, what is your religion? Maybe you take, this thing. Okay. Now, you go to the field and you get information from the field, and then, what you find can be very different from what you find from the books. So, sociological studies, something very, very interesting. You know about what is exactly going on in the society. So it is one thing to go to the definition given by the book and make, draw conclusions from that. But, that doesn't say about the society. If you take the ideal Buddhist society, you can say that, something like that. But, there are certain things. Now, for example, when I was thinking about Burmese society, I was told by people don't steal very much in Myanmar. Now, why? We can say that because they are Buddhist. Of course, that can be a good explanation, right? Because, when you take some other societies, like, this just for the comparison, like, you go to some other countries like, say, Mexico, something like that. I'm not criticizing Mexico. You are very unsafe. You are very unsafe. And then you go to South Africa, your life is not sure. And then if you go as a tourist, they say you always go by groups. You always go to places where other people are there. You never be alone. So, They will snatch your purse, take your money, maybe kill you. Now, when you come to Burma, we don't get any kind of warnings like that, right? You go anywhere in this country and, I mean, it's different. Now, of course, how are you going to explain that? To a certain extent, you can say, okay, they are Buddhists. But simply they are Buddhists doesn't explain everything. So, in order to find that situation, you have to go to the society, field research. So, what I am trying to tell you is this. Sociological studies can be quite different from conceptual or philosophical studies, okay? So, sociological studies is what we are doing is how a particular society has absorbed, certain things. Like, we are not talking about the books necessarily. Of course, that does not mean that books are not needed. Book knowledge is needed. What the book said is important. But on the other hand, what the people are doing. Now, if you look at Burma, if you look at Thailand, or if you look at Sri Lanka, any traditional Buddhist country, of course, they go for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha. But is that all? No. These people have local deities, gods, what are called nuts. And, in Thailand, Burma, all kinds of beliefs are there. But if you just say that, okay, 94% people are Buddhist, they only go for Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, that is wrong. You have to go to the society and see what people are doing. What are the people's beliefs? What people believe. In Sri Lanka, we believe in each region has gods. Sometimes each village has gods. So many gods are there. So you have to make offerings to these gods and, same thing with other Buddhist countries. If you go to Thailand, you can see that all men and women, wearing so many things, small Buddha statues and, on their neck, on their waist and, all these things. Now, how can you explain these things? Of course, a lot of people have done research on these things. Now, what it means is, sociologically, how a society behaves, how society takes to be Buddhism. Now, you can interview people and, you can get their understanding of Buddhism, what they are following. But you can't say that, no, this is wrong because it is something different in the books. Of course, it is different in the books, but what people believe is something different. So, if you look at the behavior of the Buddhist in a particular society, sociology is studying that particular behavior of the people. What Buddhists are doing in that country, in that society. What are their belief system? What are their practices? Okay. So, the looking at the society, what the society is doing, is the most important thing according to sociological studies. Now, if you want to establish or prove something in a sociological study, you always go to do a field research. Field research is you go outside the classroom, you go outside the library, and go to the people and talk and collect data. Of course, there are proper methods to collect data. There are proper methods to prepare a questionnaire. There are right questions and wrong questions. So you have to learn all these things. Of course, it is not very easy. You have to really work with the teacher and, professor, instructor, and, prepare your set of questions. And, there are technical things to do. But getting a questionnaire and interviewing people, or meeting people and asking questions, recording these things, and then analyzing that data, is very important. Okay. When we read the text, we also gather data, material, make notes. Similar way, you go to the society with a particular question, and then you look at how many people believe in those things. How many people have these beliefs, okay? So, in the sociological study, the most important thing is, basically sociology studies societies or social behavior of people. It focuses on how people as social groups behave and make decisions. An essential aspect of this mode of study is to have findings from field research to support one's conclusion. Now, the social behavior is very important. Now, there can be purely personal behavior. Now, the purely personal behavior is not a very important thing. But if it becomes a social behavior, right, then of course, that becomes important, because if we are trying to understand the society, we need to look at the behavior. So the social behavior means behavior patterns shared by a large number of members of that society. So that way we can understand that society. Now, very often in the Buddhist studies, we mix up these two things. Okay? And then sometimes, if we don't understand this methodology, then we make certain assertions, make certain claims, which other people think to be wrong, simply because we have mixed up these two methodologies. Now, say for example, if we say that, something like, okay, Sri Lankan Buddhists believe in different gods or something, or Sri Lankan Buddhism, we talk about Sri Lankan Buddhism, has these beliefs. Some very orthodox person can say, how can that be? How can then there be a Sri Lankan Buddhism? Buddhism is only one. They don't like people talking about Burmese Buddhism or Thai Buddhism or Sri Lankan Buddhism. They say that Buddhism is only one. It's true, what the Buddha taught is only one. But what people are doing is so different. What Burmese people are doing is different from what Sri Lankan people are doing. Thai people are doing differently from both Burmese and Sri Lankan people. So these are two different things. What the Buddha taught can be one thing, but what people do can be many different things. So actually, when we make this distinction, we have to make clear that whether we are making a doctrinal assertion or whether we are making a sociological observation, what we see in the society. So, very concept of Sri Lankan Buddhism or Burmese Buddhism, Thai Buddhism, some people don't like. Actually, if you understand the difference between methodology, then there is no problem. You can talk about Buddhism in general, Theravada Buddhism, shared by Thai, Sri Lankan and Burmese culture. But Burmese society or Burmese people or Burmese tradition. But at the same time, you can talk about Burmese Buddhism. In a Burmese Buddhism, the way things can be different. Dana is there, but what people give, how people give, all these things can be different from one society to the other. Okay? So we are not talking about the fundamentals of Buddhism here, but we are talking about the different behaviors of the people. So when we talk about the different behaviors of the people, we can talk about Sri Lankan Buddhism. I remember sometimes when a dream comes, people say that how can there be a Sri Lankan Buddhism? Buddha taught only one Buddhism. It's true. But when we say Sri Lankan Buddhism or Thai Buddhism, Burmese Buddhism, we are talking something different. Not about what the Buddha taught to us, but how people have absorbed certain things. Now, for example, you go to Thailand, people get ordained, become Buddhist monks for 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 3 months or something. Sometimes when their mother or father dead, they become monks for 3 months. But you don't have that in Sri Lanka. And I don't think you have that in this country. But Thailand, it has that. So that is Thai Buddhism, right? The way Thais practice Buddhism is, one aspect is that. So it can be different in different countries. Now even in this country, I think former Prime Minister U Nu became a monk for 6 times or something, right? So you can become a monk for a limited period and then you go back. But in some other countries, you don't have that. In Sri Lanka, you don't have that practice. So, it can be different. So different countries, how people do things, different. And when you go to Buddhism into new places, new countries, new locations, the behavior can be even more different. Now, in traditional Buddhist countries, your midday meal is brought into you today, right? But if you go to a place like Los Angeles, United States, Suppose your midday meal you have to give on Monday to the monks, it is usually, say Monday or Tuesday, weekday. People cannot come weekday mornings to the monastery because they have to go work. They have to drive very long time. So what the people do is they cook the meal and bring it to the monastery previous day evening. So that means today's meal is brought in yesterday. And then you put in the refrigerator. And then monks are supposed to take it out this morning and eat it, not last night, okay? So, but the meal is there from the last night in the refrigerator. Now, in a traditional Buddhist country, that doesn't happen, right? But in United States, in a huge place like Los Angeles, California, people can't do that. Now, if you look at that, can monks keep this food in the refrigerator overnight? No, that's against the Vinaya. So it's not very good according to the Vinaya. But on the other hand, monks can't go without food either. So people give it next day evening, bring to the temple. So with violation of some Vinaya rules, but that is American Buddhism, you can say. That is how Buddhists practice dana in United States. Simply as that. So there may be certain wrong things according to the tradition. Even then, people have to do that. They invite monks for a dana and ask them to, okay, Venerable, drive your car and come. We will look after your petrol cost or something. But in the traditional Buddhist countries, we never ask monks to drive their car and come to your place for dana, right? But then in other countries, monks drive. When they go out, in the different countries, not all monks, some monks drive, some monks don't drive. So, like that. And so different setups, different practices. Now, can we say that one practice is right and another practice is wrong? That's very difficult. Depending on the situations, people have done those things. So therefore, in a sociological study, we are looking at the social behavior. Now, about certain forms of behavior, we can say that, okay, this behavior is there, but it is wrong according to the Vinaya or something like that. You can say that. Of course, you put it in the context of Vinaya and see whether it is okay or not, then you can say it is not right. But that is one thing. But on the other hand, what the people do in a particular society, because we are trying to understand the society. An essential aspect of this board of studies to have findings from field research to support one's conclusions. The researcher's approach to what she or he studies may be either subjective, insider's view, or objective, outsider's view. Now, this is something very interesting. When we talk about a particular thing, especially about society, one way to do will be you as a researcher is not a part of society. You are staying outside society and you look at the society and try to report everything. But that is actually outsider view. You are not a part of the society. Now say, for example, I personally want to do a research on Myanmar society. I don't speak Myanmar language. I can't talk to people. So I will have to hire a person who speaks English and, ask questions. So I am really outside the whole thing. And then I do the research as an observer, outsider, not a part of that. But then the other thing is insider. Insider is subjective. I become a part of the society. I become the part of that practice. Now, for example, when you have a Dhamma sermon, I can be a researcher doing on that, but then I can be also going and sitting there, listening to the Dhamma, doing everything what other people do. Then what I am doing is I am becoming an insider. Okay? Now, we say, when you have a procession of people going, there are two ways. You can be a part of the procession. Then your view is one. But you can also be completely outside the procession. So you are just sitting here and then procession goes in front of you. So you are not a part of that. But you are an observer. But then, so the procession goes like this, you are sitting like this observing. But how about you also join the procession and you go with them? then you get a different feeling. You are part of the whole group. You are doing things and you are taking, but of course then your perspective is different because you don't see the whole procession. Where you are in the procession, you see only limited thing. But on the other hand, you are part of that. You feel it. When people shout and this thing and you feel it. You get the feeling out of that. The other day when, the Vassa day, I saw the people on trucks and, whistling these things and, going around and, so that is being part of the group. But then I was just sitting by the road and, looking at them. You are an observer, just seeing. So, there are these two views. One thing is the insider view. Insider view is you become a part of the institute. You want to be doing a research on the monastic institution in Burma, you become a Burmese Buddhist monk. And then you live that life. And then you study it. Or you become completely outsider and look at it and observe it. That is one way to do that. So this insider's view and outsider's view. Now this is something very much discussed in the sociological field. And discussion is like which way is the better way. Be an outsider, be an insider. Now when we talk about research, not only sociological research, we are talking about two perspectives. One thing is we are talking about subjective, or we can talk about subjectivity. The other thing is objective. Objectivity. You know the basic difference between subject and object, right? Subject is you, object is outside. Now, subjectivity and objectivity means, in science particularly, they say that a scientist has to be objective. Because whatever the scientific research, they say that you can't be a subjective part of that. It's nothing to do with you. Suppose, for example, you are a botanist, and then you want to study how, for example, rice can grow in a particular place. Then you have what is called greenhouse, where you can, control the temperature and everything, where you grow certain variety of rice, okay? As a scientist, whatever you can do is you have a greenhouse, you can put the plant, you can set the thermometer and, get the exact temperature, but you are not a part of that, you go home. And then next day you come and record the differences, and again next day you come and record the differences. You are not a part of the greenhouse. You are not a part of the research. So your research and you are completely different, right? So, this is what is called objective. So they say that in science, particularly the objectivity is the most important thing, they say. You have to be objective, nothing to do with personal thing. Okay? Now, of course, my example of greenhouse and, cultivation is very, very objective. But there can be other, like, scientific things we do, particularly with human beings. Like, we can do a research as a scientist with people in society. Particularly, we can do a research on how certain diseases are, contracted by people. But then we are dealing with the people. People can be men and women, girls and boys. Then how can a scientist, be completely objective? You are dealing with human being. When you go to do research, you find that, some men and women, some women are more attractive than other women. Can you treat them alike? Some children are crying without no food. Can you just not be moved by that? Can you just consider, no, that's nothing to do with me. I'm a part of the research. Can you do your research like that? No. If your partners of your object of research are children, if the children are crying they didn't have good breakfast, can you do your research? then you feel like getting some money from your pocket and buying something, and then what is that? You are becoming more subjective then. You feel bad. But they say that scientists cannot feel bad. It is not part of your job. You have to be very objective. Look at that. But then the problem is, can a scientist be an objective all the time like that? So there is a lot of academic debate about this particular thing. Subjectivity and objectivity. Lot of debate. Whether people. But basically the idea is that, the objectivity, the objectivity is the ideal goal of science. You do objective research. It has nothing to do with your personal thing. They also say that a scientist cannot be worried about what happens as a result of that, and that sort of thing. That is the objective view. Of course, I'm not saying that that is acceptable, but that was the kind of view associated with science particularly. You have to be really objective. Like, you can be a nuclear scientist. You don't care about, what happens if the bomb explodes or anything like that. You just do your research. But on the other hand, can you be just doing like that? Huh? Can you be just, without caring anything, just do your research? You can't. But on the other hand, with science, they say that science has to be objective. You have nothing to do with that. You are not a part of it. It should not affect your emotions. Things like that. But on the other hand, there are also arguments. How can you do that? How can you not care about, the results of your research? You spend your whole lifetime to do something very nasty. Is that worthwhile? Simply because some company is paying you a lot of money. Can you do something very bad to the society? But anyhow, classical ideal picture of science was scientist has to be objective. Nothing to do with personal. That was the idea. Okay? So I'm just explaining to you the classical standard view, but we will come to other concerns. And then these two approaches are also called ethic and emic. This also is very important. Ethic is the observer's perspective or outsider's perspective. So we say ethic, and then we say this is emic. So emic and ethic. So the emic perspective is really subjective perspective. These two terms are being used in the sociological method. Now, not very much, but still you will, in the writings, you will come across these two terms. So one thing is the emic. Emic means the subjective aspect, subjectivity. And then the ethic means objectivity or objective. So basically this view, ethic is observer's perspective, outside perspective. Emic is insider or subjective. In a field research in a village, emic is the perspective of the villagers, ethic is the viewpoint of the researcher as an outsider to the group. Now suppose you go to a particular location, particular place. Somebody comes to do a research in here about this place. So you are, as the persons who are living in here, your perspective is insider perspective. And then the person who comes from outside can be outsider's perspective. Now in those days, particularly in Asia, Africa and other countries, a lot of researchers came from, say, Western countries. And then they studied those societies. So how did they study? And what is the perspective? I remember something very interesting. There was a very well-known sociologist, Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead is a very well-known, she did research in the Western Samoa in long time ago in America. Margaret Mead, M-E-A-D. You can also look that, she's a very famous one. Now, at one point, I remember reading in her writings. Now, when she went to do her research into this island, she also had her 2-year or 3-year-old small daughter. Now, going from, I think from United States, I'm not sure, Western country. Now she was very much concerned about the cleanliness and, you have to wash your hand every time you touch something and, you have to wash your hand before you eating and, children have to be kept clean and all that. But, when she went there, she found that this was enormously difficult to do because nobody would do those things. Okay? Then finally, she had to accept the way of living in that island. So, she would just leave her daughter also with other children and, with all these things everywhere and, this thing. But nothing would happen also. So, no problem. But, today we are so concerned about the germs, bacteria and, all the time we keep children very clean. So, what happens is, if some dirt they touch, they get sick. But if you are grown up with dirt, then you have a resistance to it, You don't become really sick. So like that. Now, that means that the Margaret Mead had to become part of that society because you can't live otherwise, So, it's like that. Whether you become a part of the society or not. I still have some difficulties of becoming a part of the Burmese society, but what to do? So, and so, the researcher, what is the researcher can, what kind of attitude to adapt is very important. So here you can see when the outsider becomes an insider, then, his perspective becomes very different. Now, for example, this Margaret Mead's case again. Now, if she did not become an insider, then she will be talking about the unhealthiness of the society, how people are dirty and all that. But if you become a part of that society, then what? You don't feel that it is dirty. Your whole perception of dirtiness is changed. Actually it depends on many things. It depends on many things, like we wash quite a lot, we use a lot of detergents today, but was it like that 50 years ago in the society? No. One family had only one piece of soap. It was shared by everybody in the family. Maybe they also had only one towel or one piece of cloth to dry. But today, each member in the family has a separate piece of soap and other various bottles. It's not shared by other people. Why? This is the lifestyle we are adopting today. But of course, in different societies, different times, things were not like that. So the perspective is very important here. Whether you do your research as an outsider or insider, whether you are sympathetic to certain things or not. It is one thing when you look at from outside, it is one thing when you look at from inside. So this big debate, there are books, there are a lot of things written on this. Now, whenever you read the sociological research, actually you should read always the introductory chapter carefully, and then they talk about some of these methodological issues, okay? Now, one of the important methodological issues is what kind of research method we are using. So whether it is subjective, objective, things like that. So these are basic ideas, okay? Now next I will be showing you someone cannot become completely subjective or completely objective. But that's the next step. But the first step is for us to see these two, insider's view and outsider's view. And also emic is the observer's perspective, ethic. Emic is the insider's perspective. And then in the field research, how we look at these things. Okay. Following the sociological methods, we may study, for example, how Buddhist precepts are being practiced in any particular society, small or large. How people make use of Buddhist teachings, attitudes, views, etc. in making choices in voting, marrying, buying, eating, choices of livelihood, etc. Now you see, following the sociological methods, we may study how Buddhist precepts are being practiced. Now not only that, We can how people make use of Buddhist teachings, attitudes, etc. in making choices of voting. Now, for example, voting in election. Now, if you want to make research on that, that is what is called sociological research, right? Sociological thing. So, if you want to know what are the voting patterns, to whom people will vote, you will have to talk to people and get the information correctly in the representative manner. Otherwise, you can't draw a conclusion. But I have seen, particularly in some developed societies, for example, I remember in American society, when the election comes, the previous day they will tell the newspapers and the television, they say, such and such a candidate will win, say, 57.3. Even to that extent they predict. And when you get the results next day, it's either 57.3 or very close to it. Now, how do you do that? I mean, you can do it, you can predict it in such a way if you really get the information correctly. If you interview all the segments of representative segments of people and analyze that data, then you can almost say accurately not only who is winning, but also from what kind of margin that person will be winning. That's very interesting. So, voting, marrying, buying things, eating. Actually, this in the commercial world, there is quite a lot of research is done particularly on buying things. A lot of psychological things and sociological findings are used to sell things. When you have a product, the color of that product, the size of that product, shape of that product, all these things are based on the research on the psychology of the people. And also research on the sociological aspects of the people. For example, when they produce a car, always with the car, they say, this car will be used by people with this much monthly income and, all these things. So, sociological research determine to whom actually they are producing that particular vehicle in order to cater to the demands of that particular segment of society. So, based on sociological research. So, you get quite a lot of correct information. And then so in buying, in selling, in eating, when you have a restaurant, what are the people kind of things you are eating. So you can make use of a lot of this information if you get them really correctly. Okay, now that is one part of the sociological information. But basically now, because we are concerned about Buddhism, Buddhist research, actually somebody can do, the marriage practices in Myanmar, and how much Buddhism is a part of marriage decision in this country. When you select a partner, a girl or a boy, what are the considerations you have? Whether religion is an important thing. Now, if you want to find out that, you have to go to the society and get a segment of people, representative, and get their views. In choosing a marriage partner, are you looking at only job? Whether a person is own a house or something, whether a person comes from a very high society, what are the things you are looking for? And that whether religion is also one factor, you just can't say like that. You have to really do a research and, find out what people look for, whether religion is a fact. Then, having done a good research, you can say 35%, 40% or whatever people in this country look for religion when they are getting married, more than anything else. Some people can say, I don't care if it is my religion, I don't care whether the person is not very rich or not, or something like that. Then based on that information, you can see really what is the role played by religion in marrying. What is the role played by religion when you treat your parents, your teachers? I mean, all different things. We may do these studies not only on contemporary behavior of social groups, but also on past behavior of such groups. For such studies, the field research has to be done in archives, collection of papers, reports, diaries of people concerned, etc. So you can do not only the present, you can do the past. Okay. Now, for example, you can do how 1930s or last century people's behavior on something. Then how do you do that? Nobody is living from that period. Then, you go to the archives, you look at the books, you look at the newspapers, you look at whatever the other available material, and based on those things you, collect research and collect collect information and, draw your decisions. So this is another aspect of when you do social research. And then importance of is and ought, fact and value distinction, objectivity of knowledge. Can one be totally objective? Can we transcend ourselves? Can we really withhold our interest and approach what we study without any prejudice? Science, namely natural science, is considered to be objective. Is it really objective? What is currently accepted in social science research is participant-observer approach and observer-participant approach. Why don't I do this? Actually, I will wind up from here, but these aspects of this particular sociological research, I will discuss with you next week when we get together, okay? And then we will try to finish up this part of the discussion. So I will stop my discussion from here and leaving room for you to, if you have any questions or comments.